Aiden Corvin had never been good at timing. Of course, timing in battle was one thing, but timing when you were chosen as a war spoil by an alien queen, that was a level of misfortune he hadn't anticipated. He blinked against the pale glow of the transport vessel, the kind of light that made every shadow look like it was plotting against him. The ship hummed softly, a sound somewhere between a cat purring and a nuclear reactor, and somewhere deep in the bowels of it, a panel twitched as if amused by his presence. Aiden had already been labeled special cargo, which, in his experience, was just a fancy way of saying, they've decided your value is questionable but intriguing. He had hoped for a quiet ride to some backwater prison, or, at the very least, a cell with better lighting. Instead, he was on a floating palace hurtling across a galaxy that didn't care whether he survived or turned himself into cosmic confetti. And then he saw her. She didn't enter with fanfare or alarms. She just appeared, framed in a doorway that shimmered like heat above black asphalt. Human in shape, human in the general outline of her face, but everything else whispered wrongness in the most elegant way possible. Her long ears angled slightly outward, catching the faint luminescence of the ship, making her look like some noble creature sculpted from moonlight. Her eyes, liquid silver with flecks of molten gold, fixed on him with unsettling clarity. Aiden tried to gauge her mood, which was difficult, because she had the kind of expression that could be read both as amusement and judgment, sometimes at the same time. "Well," he said finally, because someone had to break the silence, "I've been called many things, but war spoil isn't usually one of them. Usually it's hero or moron, depending on who's telling the story." He winced at his own audacity, but the queen simply tilted her head, a movement that made her ears twitch slightly and her lips curved. Not a smile. Not exactly. Something sharper, more precise, like a scalpel made of light. "You are correct. You are unusual," she said, her voice like music that had been slowed down by a graviton wave. "And yet that is exactly why I have chosen you." Aiden considered pointing out that chosen was not really the word he would have picked for someone who could, theoretically, remove his head with a flick of a finger. Instead, he settled for humor. "Well, I'm glad my unusualness is appreciated. Usually it just gets me called names and sent to the infirmary." There was a pause, long enough for him to regret everything he'd ever said in his life, and then, to his own disbelief, she chuckled. A sound liquid and clear, like wind chimes in a storm. It startled him, not least because he wasn't sure humans were supposed to laugh in space. Her court was a vision of dissonant elegance. Guards that looked like living sculptures stood perfectly still, their skin catching light in subtle iridescence, while other members of the alien hierarchy floated just above the floor, as if gravity itself had taken a day off. Every step he took seemed to require a delicate negotiation with physics, and every gesture of his hands was watched with that unnerving attentiveness. Aiden's usual wit became both shield and weapon. He commented on the floating fruit in the banquet hall, something shaped suspiciously like a glowing octopus, and the way one of the courtiers' robes seemed to have a small black hole in it, swallowing bits of light before expelling them in little starbursts. The alien queen listened, occasionally raising one long ear as if tuning to his words, and every time she did, Aiden felt simultaneously more and less ridiculous. "Do you always speak so, recklessly?" she asked at one point, her tone both reproachful and curious. "Only when I'm about to be someone's war trophy," he replied. "Otherwise, I tend to stick to polite small talk about weather patterns on dying stars and the inefficiency of my laundry routine in zero gravity." She smiled then, and it was dangerous, that smile that hinted at amusement and challenge all at once. "You have spirit. That is unusual." Aiden shrugged, a motion that nearly sent him tumbling backward in the low gravity of the hall. "Spirit. That's one way of putting it. Mostly, I just try not to die in uncomfortable or embarrassing ways." They dined together that evening on dishes that floated like soft, glowing jellyfish. Each bite a negotiation of flavor and texture, that defied his human comprehension. Aiden cracked jokes about the soup trying to escape the spoon, earning a small, soft laugh from the Queen, the kind that made the ship feel less like a prison and more like a surreal dream. He learned that she liked subtle humor, especially when it involved mocking the absurdity of interstellar protocol or the weirdly complicated etiquette of alien courtship. Later, in a quieter corridor, she spoke again, softer this time, her voice carrying the weight of command yet tinged with a vulnerability he could barely place. "You fear me," she said simply, without judgment. "I fear a lot of things," Aiden admitted. "Mostly being eaten, trapped, or turning into a story people tell their kids about what not to do in space. But yes, you're on the list." Her ears twitched and he thought he saw a flicker of amusement, or perhaps that was just his imagination playing tricks. "You have honesty," she said, "and humor. Both are rare." He frowned. Rare. In his experience, humanity's survival depended on sarcasm and the occasional bad joke. Perhaps it was a universal law. Perhaps it was what made him tolerable, or at least survivable, to this long-eared alien queen. By the time the ship reached its first station in orbit around the alien capital, Aiden had managed to survive several delicate ceremonies, a near-fatal encounter with a floating chandelier, and at least one misunderstanding involving what he assumed was an aggressive form of greeting that turned out to be polite. He had also learned that the Queen was serious about her intentions, though whether they were political, personal, or some complicated combination of both was still impossible to discern. Humor, he decided, would be his best weapon in navigating this bizarre new world. If he could make the Queen laugh even once, maybe, just maybe, he could survive. And yet, as he lay in the surprisingly comfortable quarters designated for the human spoil, he couldn't shake the thought that he might be in over his head. The Queen's eyes haunted his dreams, flicking in silver and gold across his subconscious, ears twitching at every imagined sound. Aiden smiled faintly, though. He had survived worse odds with worse company. Surely a long-eared alien queen and a galaxy full of political intrigue were just a slightly bigger challenge. For now he would sleep, laugh at his own misfortune, and prepare to navigate a court that seemed designed to test every ounce of his wit, courage, and improbable charm. Aiden woke to the soft hum of the palace's gravity field, which was less a hum and more a gentle reminder that his body had no choice but to float if it wanted to. He had spent the night twisting and turning in ways that would have earned him an orthopedic award on Earth, and yet here he was, tangled in what the palace staff insisted was a suitable human resting apparatus. It was basically a hammock that levitated 3 inches above the floor and emitted a soothing vibration meant to adjust one's spine. Aiden decided it was both the strangest bed he had ever encountered and possibly the most comfortable, though the floating nature meant he woke up occasionally in midair, staring down at the marble floors with a mix of awe and mild panic. The Queen appeared as if conjured by thought alone, her long ears flicking as she approached. "You sleep strangely," she said, voice melodic but carrying the subtle undertone of judgment. "Thank you," Aiden said. "I've spent years perfecting the art of sleeping like a confused starfish. Apparently, it's an Earth tradition." He flailed one arm to illustrate, nearly smacking a hovering light fixture. The Queen's eyes glinted, and for a fraction of a second her expression softened into amusement. "Your species is curious," she said, "and fragile." "Fragile?" Aiden tilted his head. "I've survived planetary bombardments, ambushes, and 3 weeks without decent coffee. Fragile is a bit dramatic." She didn't respond, merely floating ahead, indicating he should follow. Aiden, wary of the gravity of obedience, pun intended, floated after her, muttering, "I'm fragile, right, like an exploding soda can." She ignored the comment, but her ears twitched in a way that suggested she was listening. Breakfast was not so much a meal as it was a ceremony in which Aiden had to guess which floating shapes were edible, which were ornamental, and which were designed to explode in your mouth if misjudged. He poked at a luminescent orb with his fork, and it quivered before releasing a tiny burst of vapor that smelled faintly of cinnamon and ozone. Aiden coughed dramatically. "Ah, yes, cinnamon and ozone, breakfast of champions," he said, earning a brief glance from the queen, which Aiden interpreted as a mixture of intrigue and suppressed laughter. After breakfast, he was led to the training chamber, a vast room where gravity shifted according to mood and light refracted into spectral patterns that disoriented the mind if you weren't careful. Here, the queen introduced him to the basics of alien etiquette, floating duels of conversation, where insults and compliments were delivered with a combination of hand gestures and musical notes emitted from one's voice, and rituals in which a misplaced twitch of an ear could provoke minor diplomatic incidents. Aiden's first attempt ended with him accidentally launching a hand gesture that, according to the guide, meant, "I despise your species," instead of the intended, "I admire your dedication." He froze midair, realizing too late that the court was silent, every eye or equivalent on him. The queen's lips curved ever so slightly. "You are learning," she said, her voice calm but her ears flicking like twin radars. "Yes," he said, trying to salvage dignity. "Learning is my specialty. I specialize in embarrassing myself while pretending to understand alien culture. It's a talent, really." After what felt like hours of floating, gesturing, and apologizing in musical tones, Aiden was escorted to a quieter corridor, where he encountered a small council of alien advisors. They were adorned in robes that shimmered and shifted, and their eyes glowed faintly, indicating mood and status simultaneously. Aiden tried to read the room, failed, and made a joke about needing a manual to understand their facial expressions. One of them tilted a head that had no ears at all but still seemed to twitch in annoyance. Aiden realized quickly that humor was both dangerous and necessary. Misstep too far, and he could end up as cosmic confetti. Joke successfully and he might just survive. The queen reappeared, her presence commanding yet strangely comforting. "You endure well," she said. "Most humans would break under such protocols or try to leave." "Leave?" Aiden snorted. "I'd have to figure out which door leads to the airlock. I'm not taking that risk before breakfast." He grinned, floating along beside her. "Besides, you make this place strangely manageable." "Manageable," she repeated, tilting her head. Her ears flicked, a gesture that Aiden had learned meant either intrigue or suspicion. "You amuse yourself even in the presence of difficulty." He shrugged. "Amusement keeps me alive." Humor is a defensive strategy, much like wearing armor, except it's invisible and occasionally works against alien courtly etiquette. The day progressed into a surreal dance of diplomacy and absurdity. Aiden was introduced to alien cuisine that floated and danced like living creatures, tried to master musical duels in which wrong notes could theoretically insult entire planets, and even participated in a minor incident where he accidentally caused a chandelier to orbit the training hall. Each time, the queen's long ears twitched in observation, her expression unreadable but not unkind. She corrected him without harshness, often with small jokes or teasing gestures that made Aiden realize she enjoyed his company more than protocol allowed. By mid-afternoon, Aiden found himself in a chamber filled with holographic constellations, where the queen attempted to teach him the planetary alignments of her people. He failed spectacularly, sending a projection of a small starship careening into a floating representation of a gas giant. "Ah," he said, dodging the holographic debris, "I am terrible at space geography. Terrible. But entertaining, surely." She laughed then, a sound that seemed to ripple through the holograms and make them shimmer. "Your mistakes are tolerable," she said, "and amusing." Aiden realized he was learning more about her than about court protocol. She was cunning, commanding, and unyielding, yet there was warmth hidden beneath the precision of her movements, the flick of her ears, the way her lips curved when she allowed herself small smiles. Humor had become their language of survival and subtle connection. His jokes and clumsy antics softened the rigidity of the court, and her laughter became both reassurance and challenge. By evening, Aiden was exhausted yet strangely exhilarated. He floated in his quarters, thinking over the day's absurdities, the floating meals, the musical debates, and the moments when the Queen's eyes lingered on him longer than etiquette allowed. He realized that humor was no longer just defense. It was the thread weaving him into this alien world. And though he was still very much a stranger here, he could sense that the Queen, with her long ears and piercing silver eyes, was beginning to see him not just as a prisoner or a war spoil, but as someone capable of navigating the impossible, sometimes with laughter, often with audacity, and always with that irrepressible human charm that refused to die even in the strangest of galaxies. The palace settled into night, but Aiden's mind refused rest. The Queen's intentions, the alien customs, and the unpredictable floating hazards all swirled in his thoughts. He smiled faintly, recognizing the challenge ahead. Survive, amuse, and maybe, just maybe, become someone the Queen didn't merely tolerate but wanted beside her. And if he could do that without breaking protocol or exploding a chandelier, it would be a victory worth the war, worth the galaxy, and worth every awkward floating step along the way. The council had been whispering all morning, a low hum of disapproval that Aiden could almost taste in the recycled air. He floated through the palace corridors, mind racing, palms itching for something to do, preferably something that didn't involve accidentally insulting a species with telepathic eyebrows. The Queen walked beside him, her long ears flicking with every subtle shift in conversation he couldn't hear. He had learned over the past weeks that those ears were like finely tuned sensors, capable of detecting not only sound but intent. He found himself admiring them, though he'd never admit it aloud. It would be a death sentence in the subtle art of alien diplomacy. "Do you sense it?" she asked, voice low but commanding. "They question you. They question me." "I sense it," Aiden said, floating slightly off balance as the floor's microgravity shifted to accommodate the morning's energy pulse. "Also, I sense that I might end up as a footnote in your history books titled, 'The Human Who Couldn't Float Properly.'" The Queen's ears twitched, and he was almost certain she had rolled her eyes. The day progressed like a carefully choreographed opera. Aiden attended council meetings where glowing charts swirled midair and advisors spoke in harmonics that made him dizzy if he tried to analyze them too literally. Every time he cracked a joke about the absurdity of orbital policy or the impracticality of anti-gravity slippers, the Queen's ears twitched in the exact way that told him he had earned a smile or a chuckle. Slowly, he realized that humor wasn't just keeping him alive. It was building influence, forging a place in the alien court where no human had ever stood before. Conflict erupted unexpectedly. A faction of the council attempted to challenge the Queen's decision, claiming that no human could hold the loyalty necessary to be considered a legitimate companion, let alone a potential spouse. The hall filled with shimmering projections of the galaxy, and arguments flew like comets ricocheting in orbit. Aiden, who had grown adept at the delicate art of interspecies diplomacy, floated to the center and raised a hand, not too high, not too low, as gravity dictated nothing and style dictated everything. "I may be a human," he said, voice carrying over the harmonic noise, "but I've survived 3 planetary bombardments, 0 gravity combat drills, and your very confusing cuisine without detonating a single chandelier. Surely that counts for something." He paused, then added with a grin, "And if nothing else, I provide excellent commentary on court proceedings, which I hear is invaluable in maintaining morale." A murmur ran through the council. The Queen's ears twitched in approval, though she maintained her composure. One of the advisors floated forward, robes swirling like a living storm. "This human is irreverent," he said. "He mocks protocol and yet he persists." "Exactly," Aiden said, spinning slightly to dodge a floating panel. "Persistence is my superpower, that and the occasional sarcastic quip." By mid-afternoon, the council's objections had been diffused, not through violence or intimidation, but through the human's audacity and the queen's subtle endorsement. Aiden realized he had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was no longer just surviving. He was participating, shaping events, and even influencing decisions that would affect an entire civilization. Humor had been his shield, but now it was his sword as well. Later, the queen led him to a quiet terrace overlooking a city of lights that floated in concentric rings above a gas giant. Stars twinkled in patterns that seemed almost designed to mock Earth's chaotic constellations. Aiden floated beside her, feeling the strange comfort of being understood even in a world so alien. "You have changed," she said softly, ears flicking in an almost shy motion. "Not only in skill but in understanding. You see the patterns where others see chaos. You fit here in a way I did not expect." "Fit here?" Aiden echoed, trying not to sound too pleased, though he could not suppress a small smile. "I still trip over gravity fields, misinterpret gestures, and occasionally make jokes that nearly start intergalactic incidents. But yes, I think I'm getting the hang of floating without looking like a drunk starfish." She laughed, the sound blending with the hum of the city. "And that is enough." Aiden felt a surprising warmth at her words. He had expected survival, adaptation, and perhaps friendship, but what he was feeling now was something more complex. Respect, admiration, and perhaps the first hints of attachment that went beyond mere necessity. Humor had brought him through danger, courage had won him safety, but empathy, he realized, had earned him connection. Their final challenge came that evening, when a minor rebellion among the council attempted one last assertion of tradition. Aiden confronted them not with weapons but with words and wit. He recounted his experiences, the mistakes, the laughter, the absurdity of learning alien etiquette while floating in zero gravity, and in doing so, he humanized himself to the council. They laughed, hesitated, and ultimately relented, acknowledging not just the queen's authority, but the presence of a human who had proven himself indispensable in ways that were neither predictable nor conventional. By nightfall, the palace was quiet. Aiden floated back to his quarters, feeling lighter, though not just because of the gravity field. He had survived, yes, but he had also transformed. He had come as a captive, a war spoil, and now he was a partner, recognized by a civilization that had seemed incomprehensible. His humor had carried him, but so had his courage, empathy, and willingness to embrace the utterly alien without losing himself. The queen appeared once more, standing in the doorway with her long ears flicking in the familiar rhythm of attention and curiosity. "You have endured," she said. "You have learned. You have chosen in your way to engage with my world. And you have tolerated me," Aiden said, floating a little closer. "Which honestly deserves a medal, or at least a nice floating plaque somewhere." She tilted her head, eyes glinting. "I have chosen, despite protocol, to offer you more than mere survival. You may remain not as a prisoner but as my companion. If you accept, marriage is an option." Aiden blinked, then smiled faintly and genuinely. "I accept. Though full disclosure, I plan to keep making jokes, floating into furniture, and generally confusing everyone. If that's acceptable." "It is," she said, and for the first time her ears drooped slightly in what he interpreted as amusement, relief, and perhaps affection. And so, in a palace that floated among the stars, where gravity obeyed whim and walls shimmered like liquid light, a human soldier found a place he had never imagined. Beside a long-eared queen who had once claimed him as war spoil, but now offered him partnership, laughter, and something closer to love. Aiden had come as a